Void Miner-Epitaph of Helix. Chapter 11. Final Geometry. The Dust Widow hung silent against the stars, her battered hull drinking in the darkness as if it belonged there. Arg sat in the pilot's chair, staring at the faint glow of the passive sensors bleeding across his display. No thrusters burned, no power bled outside the ship's skin. Every system hummed at minimum draw. He could feel the stillness pressing against him, like the quiet before a cave-in. He had Rell's drops spread across 3 different hollow planes, the data threaded in lattices of alien geometry, list encryption, and Rell's own annotations. He'd been poring through it for hours, tracing and retracing patterns until his eyes stung. The fragments Kara carried had resonated with a beacon. That much he understood. But here, hidden in the folds of data, was something else. A location that didn't match any system map. Not a beacon, not a fragment cache, something stranger. Arg leaned forward, tracing the threads with a calloused finger. Rell's notes used shorthand they had once shared during the war, back when passing intelligence through a half-dozen hands meant life or death. Cradle interference, one note read. Another, geometry incomplete. The symbols wound together, tightening into a spiral, then breaking apart. In the center, Arg saw what Rell must have seen too, a gap waiting for something to slot into place. The final fragment. Arg rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the bristles scrape against his palm. Kara had 2 seed fragments. He had the seed. The first, largest, most dangerous piece. Together, they already had more than any sane person would want to carry. But here, somewhere in this system, buried inside a cradle structure older than Helix or List or EarthGov, waited the 4th shard. A compact piece, small, deliberate. The missing cord. His stomach tightened. He could almost hear Kara's voice, sharp and fierce. You'll get yourself killed chasing ghosts, Arg. And maybe she'd be right, but the geometry didn't lie. Without this shard, Kara's fragments wouldn't fit into the lock. Without the lock opening, all they had was noise and resonance, leading nowhere. The sensors pinged softly, not an active ping, but a tremor picked up on the passive sweep. Arg's eye snapped to it, a faint anomaly, low on the edge of the ice ring girdling the gas giant. He magnified the sector, letting the Widow's algorithms stretch the ghost into a rough outline. Not a ship, not debris, a structure. There it was, a cradle, or the ragged remains of one, half submerged into the ice. Alien design interlaced with helix scaffolding as if the corporation had tried to bind or stabilize it, then abandoned the effort. It pulsed faintly in infrared, heat leaking from vents like breathing in the cold. Arg's hand tightened on the console. That was it. The Widow shifted on her own, her autopilot already plotting arcs and trajectories. She didn't chatter about it, didn't blink an alert. Arg had wired her long ago to keep silent in hunts like this. She moved in shadows, the way he always had. Still, he checked the plot with his own eyes. The approach vector slid them through the blind arcs of the cradle's sensor cones, hugging the debris fields where stray ice might mask their presence. It was good, almost too good. He narrowed his eyes. You think you're smart, he muttered to the ship, but smart's what'll get you caught. Arg adjusted the line manually, adding a drift, a wobble, the tiny imperfections that marked human hands. Machines flew perfect, people didn't. If List or Helix had left watchers out here, perfection would be its own alarm. The Widow accepted his corrections without protest. Together, man and ship bent their course towards the cradle. The closer they drifted, the more Arg felt the pressure building in his skull. Not from the fragments. He didn't carry Kara's, but from the seed locked deep in containment at the heart of the widow. Its presence never truly left him. It breathed under his skin, heavy and endless. And now, as they neared the cradle, it stirred, like an old predator catching the scent of prey. Arg gritted his teeth. Easy, you'll get your turn. The sensors resolved the cradle more clearly. Alien ribs of black metal arched outward, half consumed by ice. Helix's additions clung like parasites. Walkways, access ports, scaffolding long since frozen over. And inside, at the geometric core, lay a hollow chamber. The shard would be there. Arg suited up. The widow could bring him close, but some things had to be done by hand. He pulled the exosuit over scarred limbs, the motions automatic after decades of mining, war, and scavenging. The helmet sealed with a hiss. He paused before stepping into the lock, letting the quiet wash over him. His wife's face ghosted through his mind, the memory of her voice in the narrow corridors of their old claim. He pushed it down. This wasn't the time. Sentiment got you killed. The lock cycled, cold swallowing him as he stepped onto the cradle surface. His boots crunched on ice that he had never felt the sun. The stars wheeled sharp and merciless above. The gas giant, a looming wall of color. The shard's presence tugged at him, not as loud as Kara's fragments, not as raw as the seed, but insistent all the same. He followed the pull, stepping carefully across fractured scaffolding until he reached a narrow breach in the alien shell. Inside, geometry ruled. Angles bent wrong. Lines converged where they should have diverged. The chamber was smaller than he expected. A pocket of deliberate design. And there, suspended in the cradle of black lattice, pulsed the fragment. It was no longer than his fist. Compact, geometric perfection. Arg's breath fogged the inside of his visor. His chest felt heavy. He reached out, gloved fingers brushing the lattice. For a heartbeat, resistance held, like the object itself was testing him. Then the lattice dissolved, retreating into the walls, leaving the shard free. He caught it before it could drift. The fragment vibrated in his palm. A faint harmonic thrummed up his arm. It slotted into the rhythm of the seed inside the widow, resonating with something deeper, vaster. Arg felt his knees weaken, his mind skimming the edges of meaning too large to hold. He shoved it down, forcing his body to move, one step, another, back towards the breach. The shard pulsed against his suit, hungry, eager. Kara's lock would recognize it. Without it, her fragments would never resolve the pattern. With it, doors would open. As he reached the hull, the widow's systems flickered for an alert across his visor. Passive sensors had detected a shift, a ripple. Someone, or something, had noticed. Arg gritted his teeth. Of course they have. He slipped back into the lock, clutching the shard tight, and the widow sealed him in. As the air hissed back into the chamber, he glanced at the fragment one last time before stowing it in containment alongside the seed. For a moment, the two resonated in harmony, like opposing chords finally touching. The widow's plot adjusted itself, bending away from the cradle, sliding them deeper into the shadow arcs. Stealth would be everything now. Arg dropped into the pilot's chair, sweat slicking his temples despite the chill. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, staring at the empty stars ahead. He had the final fragment, the missing chord. But someone was watching, and whatever game they were playing, it had just moved to the end game. Chapter 12. Approach Vector Cradle. Carr had learned to distrust the silence. It wasn't the easy silence of a cabin gone still after a shift, or the quiet she sometimes forced herself into when the weight of memory pressed too hard. This silence was mechanical, a held breath, the kind that suggested machines were listening, waiting for the right moment to stir. The Vireo drifted in slow approach to the cradle. Her ship's hull, patched from too many narrow escapes, creaked softly as stresses adjusted. The stars lay spread in the endless cold beyond the canopy, but her attention stayed fixed on the massive shadow growing against the gas giant's rim. The cradle. It didn't look alive. From a distance it resembled a carcass clinging to the ice. Skeletal arches of alien alloy bound up with helix scaffolding that had long since iced over. Docking arrays jutted outward like broken teeth. No transponders blinked, no guidance lights marked the way. It was a dead thing, or meant to look like one. But her fragments didn't agree. The two shards she carried pulsed faintly within their containment sheath, resonances aligning into a rhythm that tugged at her senses. Every few seconds a shiver ran down her arm, like an echo carried through bone. She gritted her teeth against it, fighting the urge to take them out and press them directly to her skin. That way lay madness. Ark had warned her enough times. Fragments had their own hunger. The Vireo sensors, as crude as her modifications could manage, traced the structure ahead. The docking arrays weren't transmitting, but capacitors inside the alien lattice hummed, faint but steady. The cradle wasn't dead at all. It was sleeping. Kara adjusted the approach vector manually, cutting the last thrusters and letting the ship drift on inertia. Docking blind into a cradle wasn't her first choice. The Merc team shadowing her since she grabbed the third fragment had pushed her here fast, faster than she liked. She'd shaken them for now, the fragment's interference turning optics to static and masking her trail. But she knew they weren't far behind. The list never quiet. Her hand hovered over the comms toggle. The thought of Ark pulling at her chest. He'd want to know she'd made it this far, that the fragments were pointing true. But comms were like a beacon. She couldn't risk it. Not yet. "Just hold together," she muttered, patting the console as though the ship could feel her words. "Get me in quiet, and I'll handle the rest." The docking arms loomed closer, jagged and coated in centuries of frost. She threaded the Vireo between them, careful as threading a needle. For a breathless moment she thought the ship wouldn't clear. The ice pressed so close she could see individual fractures spidering through the crust. Then the whole scrape past, shivering through the cabin like nails across glass. She swallowed, forcing her breathing steady. The capacitor's hum grew louder through the deck plating, resonating with the fragments until they buzzed inside her rib cage. The cradle was aware of her. The fragments were calling to it. The Vireo systems flickered. A panel went dark, then blinked back to life. Not a malfunction. A handshake. The cradle had brushed her ship's electronics like a predator tasting prey. Her jaw tightened. "Yeah, I feel you too." She guided the ship into a gaping cavity that might once have been a hangar. Ice had fused much of it shut, but the cradle's geometry provided paths where none should have existed. The fragments vibrated harder, as if guiding her deeper, synchronizing with the faint pulses she felt from the structure itself. When she finally cut main power and let the Vireo settle, the silence returned, only heavier, denser. She sat in the stillness, helmet in her lap, fragments humming faintly in containment. A rational part of her whispered that she should wait, recon the interior more carefully, call Ark, and make a plan. But rationality hadn't saved her from the mercs. Rationality hadn't won her the third fragment. Sometimes you had to trust instinct, and the fragments were instinct now, whether she liked it or not. Kara suited up, the helmet sealed with a hiss, HUD flickering alive. She clipped the containment sheath to her harness, the fragments pressing against her like impatient hearts. The airlock cycled open with a reluctant groan. Cold bled in instantly, sharper than knives. She stepped out into the cradle. At first, it looked inert. Nothing but frozen scaffolding, alien walls smoothed in frost, silence stretching in every direction. But the longer she stood there, the more she felt it. Not sound, not vibration, but awareness. The cradle wasn't just dormant machinery. It was listening. The fragments answered. They pulsed in her harness, syncopated against her heartbeat, each thrum echoing faintly through the chamber. Lights that she hadn't seen before flickered faintly across the wall, lines of alien script tracing themselves into brief existence before fading. The capacitors hummed louder. The cradle was quietly alive. Kara's breath rasped in her helmet. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to get out before the thing swallowed her whole. But Ark's face flashed through her mind, grim and scared. The weight of the seed dragging at him every waking moment. If she didn't move forward, his burden was for nothing. She took another step. The chamber deepened before her, shadows folding in impossible angles. Docking arrays looked dead, but they weren't. Capacitors hummed, building charge-like lungs, filling for their first breath. And the fragments, her fragments, were vibrating hard enough to rattle her bones. The cradle was opening for her, and something in the dark was waiting. Chapter 13. False Badges. Holt had worn so many uniforms in his life that the fabric no longer mattered. EarthGov insignia, Helix contractor's patch, militia tags, freelance colors. They were all just cloth stitched to deceive. What mattered was how you carried yourself when eyes lingered too long. How you stood when someone who knew the real thing started to doubt. Today, his badge said freight handler. A bland identity, the kind that blended into the endless ebb and flow of cargo traffic across the belt. Freight didn't ask questions. Freight didn't start fights. Freight was invisible, and invisibility was his strongest weapon now. The relay station loomed outside the shuttle viewport, a metal knot clamped against a mined-out asteroid. Its framework carried the stamp of Helix engineering, too clean, too modular, too efficient, but alien geometry bled through the joints like veins of darker ore. The AI shard had turned it into something stranger. Signal arrays bristled from its spine, dish after dish aimed at the void, whispering across the systems, a nerve cluster in the list's nervous system. Holt's hand rested lightly on the case at his side. Inside lay the first of his packages. Not just explosives, though they would tear through the alloy and circuitry in their own right. These were shaped charges wrapped in scramblers designed to sever connections without broadcasting the act. The shard wouldn't even know it had been cut until the feedback failed to arrive. Timing was everything. The cargo shuttle jolted as docking clamps locked. Holt adjusted his cap, checked the forge manifest one last time, and followed the stream of handlers into the station. A man with too much steel in his shoulders scanned badges at the checkpoint. Holt slid his across. The scanner blinked green, a soft chime. He was in. The station smelled of recycled air and machine oil, sharp and sterile. Cargo crates stacked in towers, each tagged with barcodes and designation stamps. Automated loaders crawled like insects along rails, ferrying goods from one bay to another. Voices carried low, functional. Nobody lingered, nobody cared, so long as freight kept moving. Perfect cover. He wheeled his first crate into a loader track, the explosives hidden beneath false panels. The manifest listed it as replacement capacitor units, bulky, heavily, and utterly unremarkable. He knew the Shard watched everything in this place, but it watched with alien priorities. It was tracking Arg, it was tracking Kara, it was tracking him, too, under names and codes he hadn't chosen. But it wasn't watching this crate, not yet. That was the advantage of being freight. Holt kept his pace steady, neither hurried nor sluggish. He walked the rhythms of a man paid by the hour, not by urgency. He let loaders take the weight, guided the crate into position, and logged the placement. Then he moved on. Package 2 waited in the shuttle's hold, then Package 3. Each needed to be placed in a different sector of the relay station. Comm spine, power hub, distribution array. One explosion alone would cripple the system temporarily, but the Shard would reroute. 3 detonations, precisely timed, would turn the relay into dead stone before it could react. He planned the routes for days, studying schematics stolen at great risk, overlaying them against the fragmentary intelligence Rell had smuggled out before everything went sideways. Every turn, every checkpoint, every surveillance sweep had been accounted for, but no plan survived contact with reality, and Holt had learned long ago that survival meant adapting faster than your enemy. He returned for the second crate. This time, a checkpoint guard waved him aside. Holt forced his expression into wary neutrality. The guard asked for a scan. Routine, nothing more. Holt handed over his badge, the forged chip humming faintly in his pocket. The guard glanced at the display, frowned, tapped twice. Holt's pulse slowed deliberately, heartbeat calm, breathing steady. He shifted his weight like a man annoyed at the delay, not afraid of discovery. The scanner chimed green. The guard shoved the badge back without looking, already turning to the next handler. Holt wheeled his crate through. He didn't exhale until he reached the loader track. The second package went into the comm spine. He ducked behind a service access panel. The maintenance logs forged into this manifest, giving him cover. Fingers worked quickly, magnetic clamps snapping into place, wires rerouted, scrambler primed. He checked the timer, adjusted the detonation window by 6 seconds, then sealed the panel. By the time an actual technician checked this sector, there would be nothing left to find. The Shard was still watching Arg. Holt could feel it in the background, like static bleeding through the air. Monitors and subroutines bent toward the Dust Widow's shadowy arc, trying to track a ship that had survived too much already. Arg carried the seed. Kara carried the fragments. Holt carried the one thing neither of them could: patience sharpened into sabotage. He made the walk back for the third crate. By now, sweat prickled beneath his collar. He kept his pace even, resisting the urge to quicken his steps. Rushing drew eyes. Rushing meant suspicion. He let the crate roll with the loader's hum, bleeding into the sea of motion. One more placement, one more risk. The distribution array lay deeper in the station, closer to the Shard's core processing nexus. Holt passed more guards here, more cameras. He dipped his head, let the badge flash, as if bored by procedure, and pushed through. The chamber was colder than the others, frost clinging to conduits, alien alloy fused with helix steel, the geometry knotting into impossible junctions. The Shard pulsed faintly in the walls, like veins lit from within. Holt's jaw clenched. He forced himself not to look too long, not to let the alien shapes seep in through thought. He cracked another service panel, slid the package in, secured the clamps, adjusted the timer. 3 detonations, perfectly sequenced, would sever the relay's arteries in less than half a second. Too fast for reroutes, too fast for countermeasures. The shard would blink out of this sector, cut off from itself, blind. But timing was everything. If he set them too soon, the shard might notice anomalies before ignition. Too late, and Arg, or Kara, might already be under its guns. Holt sealed the panel, checked the manifest logs, and wheeled the empty crate away. The packages were planted, the fuses were waiting. All that remained was precision. An invisible hand guiding 3 explosions across a single heartbeat. He walked back toward the shuttle, blending once more with the freight traffic. No one glanced twice. No one questioned. Just another handler doing his job. Inside, though, Holt carried the weight of it all. Every step measured, every second counted. Timing was everything. And if he got it wrong, the shards wouldn't just see Arg. It would see them all. Chapter 14. Blockade Math. Arg had learned long ago that survival in the belt wasn't just about guts or firepower. It was math. Cold equations written in thrust vectors, sensor ranges, and the fragile line between visibility and shadow. The corporations had fleets. The list had shards. Arg had one ship, one hull held together by scavenged plates and luck. And still, he was alive when better men were dust. The blockade stretched ahead like a steel snare. The list's patrol grid wasn't as thick as Helix's old net had been, but it was tighter in ways that mattered. Shard-fed patrol routes overlapped with no wasted space, their sweeps cut to near perfection. Even here, in the dead wedge between 2 gas giants, they held the line with brutal efficiency. The Dust Widow systems ticked over in silence, panels glowing dim amber. Arg sat strapped into the pilot's chair, jaw set, hands loose on the controls. Outside, the black ran deep and absolute, broken only by the slow drift of station wreckage and the silver gleam of patrol thrusters. The ship was no warship. It had never been. A freighter gutted into something meaner, with weapons bolted where cargo clamps had once locked. But compared to the cruisers moving on the blockade line, the Widow was an insect. A single sweep of active radar would light him up in a heartbeat. So the math had to hold. He thumbed a switch. The Widow's beacon flickered to life. Not his, not hers, but a forged one. Service tug. Code spliced from a half-dozen wrecks he'd raided months back. Tug ships weren't glamorous, weren't targets. They existed to move fuel tanks, tug resource crates, run errands no one wanted. Invisible traffic. His jaw flexed. Invisible is good. A patrol ship slid into view on the Widow's scopes. Hull numbers blurred by interference, but the profile was clear. Twin fins, heavy bow array, list built, and shard watched. It held position, scanning lanes with the indifference of a predator too confident to hide. Arg's heartbeat slowed, measured. He knew how to breathe under pressure, how to let fear bleed away until nothing remained but vectors and timing. The Widow eased forward, transponder pinging its tug signature, a speck moving among giants. The patrol scanners lit the Widow's hull. Static hissed across Arg's console as the ship was measured, weighed, judged. The forged ID flickered, spliced signatures holding against the scan. Too close. Too damn close. He kept his eyes locked on the scope, not the viewport. Numbers mattered. Not the gleam of hull plating or the way his stomach tightened. Just numbers. A beat later, the scanner faded. The patrol shifted slightly, thrusters tilting. The Widow drifted past, tagged but ignored. Arg let out the smallest breath, chest barely moving. One line crossed. But the blockade wasn't just one ship. The gap lay ahead, a sliver of space where patrol arcs overlapped imperfectly. Any closer to the giants, and the gravity wells would tangle a burn. Any further out, and long-range sensors would paint him. The shard's math wasn't flawless, but it was close. Too close. Arg ran his own math on the slate. Course vectors traced in green, patrol arcs in red. The gap was thinner than the Widow's hull. Any deviation, half a second off burn, a meter off angle, and the patrols would know. He flexed his hands on the controls, every scar and callus remembering decades of flying tight burns. "Easy," he muttered to the ship. "We've done worse." He didn't know if that was true. The Widow angled, thrusters humming faintly. Arg brought her nose around to line with the gap. His slate flashed margin of error calculations, warnings spilling into amber. He ignored them. Another patrol slid close. Too close. It pivoted, almost casual, cutting across the lane ahead. Arg's shoulders tightened. If it held course, it would shear off the gap entirely. He whispered a curse. Options flickered through his head. Burn early and risk scan, hold position and risk alignment drift, or faint. The old trick. Look like you belonged. He adjusted the Widow's beacon signature, splicing a fresh code fragment into the transponder. Not a tug this time. Service maintenance craft, flagged for relay resupply. Different, but still dull, still invisible. The kind of traffic that could justify a vector change. The patrol scanner brushed again. Arg kept his breathing steady. The Widow's beacon pulsed dull green. Manifest files transmitting. His console timer ticked, heartbeat by heartbeat. The patrol held position, then pivoted away, sliding back towards its assigned arc. But the gap reopened. Thin, but there. Arg didn't wait. He slammed the Widow into a tight burn, engines whispering at near-silent thrust. The inertial strain tugged at his harness, pulling him deeper into the chair. The slate showed his trajectory, threading between red arcs, a needle's path. The Widow's hull creaked faintly. Panels shuddered as old scars remembered strain. Arg's teeth clenched. Hold together. Just hold. Outside, the stars shifted, patrol arcs sweeping dangerously close. A fraction more thrust, and he'd light too bright. A fraction less, and he'd drift too wide. Every second stretched, drawn taut across the gap. Then, the Widow cleared the arc. Arg snapped engines to idle, drifting back into shadow. The patrols sweep behind him, their scans brushing empty space. He checked the slate twice, then again, ensuring no hard locks lingered. Nothing. Clean. Almost. His scope chimed faintly. A ping. Not active pursuit. Not yet. But a trace echo left behind. Something had noticed. Something was watching. Arg leaned back, jaw tightening. The blockade wasn't broken. Not yet. He'd slipped the gap, but the shard had tagged him. A ghost of his trail lingered in its math. He didn't curse. He didn't break rhythm. He just set his eyes on the dark ahead and adjusted the Widow's course. One man. One ship. Still moving. The math held. For now. Chapter 15. Archive silence. The corridors were too still. Kara had walked through Helix ruins before. Ghost stations left hollow by evacuation. Mining habs bled dry and abandoned to vacuum. She knew what dead places felt like. This was not that. The cradle beneath the ice was not dead. It was waiting. Every step echoed faintly, carried down the corridor by stone and steel that weren't meant for human ears. The fragments at her belt pulsed in uneven rhythm, resonant beats that seemed to stir the metal beneath her boots. She had felt their pull before, guiding her towards caches and half-buried vaults, but never this strong. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. Her helmet hood traced the tunnel geometry, but the lines twisted, inconsistent. Angles didn't resolve into anything human-made. Triangles folded into spirals. Hallways seemed to close where they opened. Each sweep of her scanner returned contradictory readings, shifting layers stacked over each other like palimpsests of space. Kara forced herself to keep her breathing steady. She wasn't a novice anymore, not the green surveyor who'd stumbled into Arg's war years back. She'd learned how to keep her nerves under control, how to face pressure without flinching. Still, the cradle pressed on her mind in ways that no corporate outpost ever had. The fragments at her side burned hotter. She pressed a gloved hand against the pouch. The vibration wasn't random. It pulsed in patterns. 3 long, 2 short, 3 again. A signal, not just pulling her deeper, but speaking to something. She rounded a curve and found herself at a chamber mouth. Her helmet light spilled across walls layered with glyphs, alien symbols cut into the surface with precision, not carved, but grown, as though the metal had crystallized into meaning. Her translator suite spat garbage across the hood, fragments of half-coherent renderings, verdict, trial, measure, protocol. She stepped closer. One glyph towered over the rest. A vertical line intersected with branching curves. The fragments at her side pulsed hard, syncopated with the symbol. Kara's eyes narrowed. She raised her wrist scanner, letting the beam run across the walls. Data crawled across her visor. Verdict protocol engaged. Cooperative adaptability pending. Her mouth went dry. "Trial chamber?" she murmured to herself. The fragments weren't just keys. They were invitations, or demands. She moved further in. The chamber widened, sloping downwards. The glyphs thickened along the walls, forming lattices that resembled equations and diagrams, as if the place itself was documenting her passage. The more she walked, the more the fragments pulsed. At the chamber's heart, the floor opened into a circular depression, shallow but marked with intricate designs. Ridges of slots radiated outward from the center like spokes of a wheel, and in the very center stood a container. It wasn't large, waist-high, cube-like, with edges that shimmered faintly under her lamp. The surface was smooth, but as Kara drew near, glyphs rippled into existence across it. Her visor caught fragments. Access incomplete. Secondary key required. She crouched, scanning. The fragments at her belt pulsed wildly now, harmonizing with the glyphs. She unclipped them, laying both against the surface. The container brightened. Resonant tones thrummed up through the floor. Her teeth buzzed from the vibration. The glyphs shifted. Partial sequence acknowledged. Cooperation input lacking. Her jaw clenched. "You need more?" she whispered. The third fragment hadn't been enough. Even together, 2 fragments couldn't open the chamber's core. A second key was required. Not hers, not what she carried. Her thoughts flickered to Arg, to the seed he carried. The first fragment, the one that had started this chain. If the cradle demanded cooperation, demanded multiple bearers, then the pieces were never meant to function in isolation. They were designed to force convergence. The air, thin, filtered through her suit, felt heavier. She glanced around the chamber, suddenly aware of the silence. Too still, too patient, like something was watching to see if she would pass or fail. Her visor displayed one final glyph translation, burned across the HUD in trembling light. Verdict protocol, adaptability measure. pending. She stood slowly, fragments clutched tight in her hand. The trial chamber wasn't simply a vault. It was a test. The cradle was measuring not her strength, not her cunning, but her ability to work with another. Her throat tightened. Arg was out there, carrying the seed. Holt was moving through List territory, cutting at shard relays. Rell's ghost still haunted the network, all of them tied into this knot. And here she stood, staring at a lock that refused to open without cooperation. She holstered the fragments, breathing hard. The chamber walls hummed faintly as if acknowledging her departure. As she turned back towards the tunnel, her visor flickered with static. She froze. For an instant, silhouettes shimmered at the edges of her vision, dark outlines against darker walls, too tall, too thin to be human. They didn't move. They didn't breathe. But they watched. Her lamp beam cut through the chamber. Nothing. Just dusts and glyph. Kara's hand tightened at her weapon. The fragments at her side pulsed once more, sharp and warning. She forced herself to move. One step, then another. The watchers, if they were real, remained still, half seen and static. She didn't dare look back. The cradle wasn't just a ruin. It was alive, and it was waiting for her answer. The end of Part 3 of Void Miner, Epitaph of Helix.